many times does a black child have to prove they're innocent just to sit in peace? The late afternoon sun dripped warm light over Willoughby Park in Atlanta, painting long shadows beneath the swaying oaks and playground swings. The sounds of laughter and running feet filled the air, mixing with the chirping of birds and the quiet hum of a city winding down. It was the kind of moment that felt untouched by conflict, the kind that should have stayed undisturbed. At the edge of a stone fountain, a teenage boy sat alone on a weathered bench. His name was Malik Carter, age 14, lanky from basketball drills and still growing into his height. A dog-eared copy of The Martian rested open on his lap. He wasn't reading for school. He was reading because he loved how words carried him into other worlds, safer ones. He wore a clean white t-shirt, faded jeans, and a pair of blue Nikes that had seen one too many summer pickup games. Every few minutes, Malik glanced down at his phone. His mother, Camille Carter, had texted earlier. Her city council meeting was running late. She'd pick him up soon, she promised. Malik didn't mind waiting. The park had always felt like a sanctuary, a patch of quiet in a world too noisy with judgment. Until that day. Across the walking path, sitting stiff on another bench, was Joanne Whitmore, a white woman in her mid-40s with a tightly coiled bun and the kind of presence that made everything feel too still. Her beige khakis were perfectly pressed, her blouse tucked in with military precision, but it was her eyes, cold, assessing, locked on Malik, that shattered the calm. She didn't look at the children playing. She didn't smile at the joggers passing by. She only watched Malik. At first he ignored it. Maybe she was just zoning out. Maybe she wasn't even looking at him. But after 10 minutes her head turned with his every move. When he checked his phone, when he sipped from his water bottle, when he flipped a page in his book. She never blinked. Malik's fingers tightened around the paperback. He knew this look. He'd felt it before, in department stores, school hallways, sidewalks at night. That quiet tension, the unspoken suspicion, the fear that didn't look like fear, but control disguised as concern. Still, he kept still. His mother always told him, "Stay calm. Don't give them a reason." But Joanne didn't need a reason. She reached for her phone and began whispering, glancing at Malik between sentences. His heart pounded. Not loud, but steady. A beat that matched the creeping dread curling into his spine. Seconds later, she stood and crossed the walkway, heels clicking like accusations. Malik sat up straight. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice sharp like a warning. "I'm just waiting for my mom," Malik replied, polite, steady, though his throat felt tight. "You've been here too long," she snapped. "People like you don't just loiter around here." He flinched at her words. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, his voice lower now. "She's coming to pick me up." Joanne didn't listen. She didn't want truth. She wanted control. Without another word, she dialed 911. "Yes, there's a suspicious individual here at Willoughby Park. Black male, teenager. He's been watching people, acting strange. I think he's up to something." Malik sat frozen, his palms slick with sweat. Should he run? No. Rating only proved her story, and in America, when you're young and black, running can mean not surviving. Minutes passed like hours. Then, sirens. 2 police cars burst onto the curb. Stepped out, one young, hand already near his belt, eyes scanning for a threat. The other older, more measured. They looked at Malik like they already knew him. They didn't care. As he stood up, hands trembling in the air, Malik wasn't thinking about the book he left behind on the bench. He wasn't even thinking about Joanne, standing behind the officers, arms crossed like a satisfied judge. He was thinking, what if my mom doesn't get here in time? Fuck. What happens next will shake the silence of this park, this city. And maybe, just maybe, our idea of justice itself. Now, before we dive deeper into the unfolding moments, into the rage, the heartbreak, and the power of what comes next, I invite you to settle in. Take a deep breath. Pour yourself a glass of water. Find a quiet place. Because this is not just a story. It's a reflection. And every detail matters. Malik Carter had never felt unsafe in Willoughby Park. Not until now. The wind shifted slightly as he stood motionless beside the fountain, his book forgotten on the bench. The pages flipped lazily in the breeze, as if mocking how quickly peace could be torn apart. Joanne Whitmore stood 10 feet away, her phone pressed tight against her ear. Her voice, once a whisper, now rang out loud enough for nearby joggers to hear. Yes, I'm at Willoughby Park. A suspicious black male teenager, tall, alone. He's been loitering for almost an hour. He won't leave. I think he's scouting. Her words didn't match the scene. Malik wasn't moving. He wasn't talking. He wasn't doing anything. But her voice transformed the truth into a threat. A small child, with a popsicle in hand, looked up from the jungle gym, tugging on her father's sleeve. The man turned, spotted Joanne, then Malik, and hesitated. His hand reached for his own phone, unsure. The air thickened. The quiet harmony of the park began to splinter. Laughter faded. Conversations died mid-sentence. An invisible current of tension rippled outward from Joanne's voice like a shockwave. Malik stayed rooted. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He simply stood, with his hands visible, his spine straight, his pulse screaming beneath his skin. He remembered what his mother taught him. Stay visible, stay calm, stay alive. But inside, his thoughts were chaos. What if they believe her? What if I say the wrong thing? Now, what if she's already decided what I am? In the distance, sirens. One cruiser. Then another. Red and blue lights painted the trees like a strobe of warning. The grass seemed to dull under their flickering pulse. Malik felt like he'd been dropped into a movie scene. But this one wasn't fiction. This one was his. The police car screeched to a stop at the edge of the park. Doors swung open. 2 officers emerged. The first, Officer Brennan, was tall, broad-shouldered, mid-30s. His eyes locked on Malik like a hunter sighting movement in the brush. His right hand hovered dangerously close to his weapon. The second officer, Sergeant Nolan, was older, mid-50s, with calm eyes and a tired gait. He scanned the park, absorbing everything: the crowd, the posture of the boy, the flush on Joanne's face. Officer Brennan's command was immediate. "Hands where I can see them." Malik's voice cracked. I didn't do anything." "Now, sir." Malik raised his hands, slow and deliberate, as the crowd began to circle. Parents shielding children, teens recording with their phones. Nobody interfering. Just eyes, watching, judging. Brennan moved in fast, towering over the boy. "Step away from the bench." "I was just waiting for my mom. She's coming any minute." "Do you have a name?" Camille Carter." Brennan blinked. He didn't recognize the name. Not yet. Song Jean-Lo finally stepped forward. He raised a hand to Brennan. "Let's not escalate," he said under his breath. "He's a kid." Brennan frowned, but obeyed. "For now." Joanne strode over, pointing. "That's him. He's been watching people. I told him to move. He didn't? Who just sits on a bench in a park for an hour? Nolan turned slowly toward her. That's what benches are for, ma'am. And it doesn't belong here. Those words, Malik heard them clear as thunder. He doesn't belong. As if the space under the sky, on a park bench, in the open sun, was not his. Brennan turned back to Malik. And Scott, you had any ID? Malik shook his head, barely. I'm 14. I don't carry ID. You always come here? Only when my mom's running late. She's at City Hall. Nolan tilted his head. What's your mom do? She's the mayor. A pause. The words didn't land immediately. Brennan scoffed. Mayor. Oh. And then the sound of tires. A sleek black SUV turned the corner and rolled to a halt. It was unlocked, and out stepped Camille Carter, Atlanta's youngest sitting mayor, black, bold, commanding. She wasn't wearing a badge. She shouldn't be one. She wore a Navy male power suit, heels that clicked like punctuation, and eyes that burned hotter than the Georgia sun. Malik? She called. Her son's shoulders sagged with relief. Camley's gaze swept the scene. Her son with hands raised, the officer standing too close. The woman with guilt creeping into her expression like a shadow at sundown. What? She said, voice controlled but seething, is going on here? Sergeant Nolan stepped back, Brennan straightened like he'd swallowed a blade. Joanne paled. Malik lowered his hand slowly. Camille crossed the grass toward them, her heels silent now on the soft earth. She stood between her son and the officers. I asked a question, she said again. Why was my son, a minor, treated like a suspect for sitting on a public bench? Brennan opened his mouth. Nolan cut him off. We received a call about suspicious behavior. We're following protocol. Protocol? Camille repeated. Your protocol is to approach a child with your hand on your weapon? We matched the description, Brennan added, too quickly. And what was the description? Camille asked. Brennan hesitated. Nolan spoke. Black teenager, alone, reading a book. The absurdity of it floated for a moment, suspended like smoke. Malik looked up at his mother, eyes glassy but proud. Camille exhaled, slow and deliberate. Then she turned to Joanne. And you, what exactly did you think he was doing? Joanne fumbled. He was sitting too long, watching people. I didn't know. You didn't ask, Camille said. You assumed. I was trying to be safe. The park was silent. Birds stopped chirping. Even the trees seemed to pause. Malik spoke next. I just wanted to finish my chapter. Camille placed her hand on his shoulder. Well, she said, you're going to finish it right here, right now. She turned back to the officers. Be filing a report. And if either of you approached anyone else this way without cause, I promise it won't go unnoticed. Nolan nodded solemnly. Brennan said nothing. Joanne took a step back, her eyes on the ground. Camille and Malik walked together toward the SUV. As the door shut, Malik looked out the window at the bench, his book still sitting on it, the pages fluttering in the wind, like it had been waiting for him to return. And it would, because this park, this city, belonged to him too. It was supposed to be over. The car door shut with a clean, muffled thud, sealing Malik and his mother from the crowd, from the flashing lights, from the hundreds of staring eyes that still lingered in the air like smoke. But the silence inside the SUV wasn't peace. It was weight. Tension pulled tight, unspoken, stretched between them like the seatbelt across Malik's chest. Chilon-Piston chemical crash von Billboard was. Monsieur Dagley's mouth tipped up into a line. Malik stared forward, unblinking, lips pressed into a line, his hand still slightly trembling on his lap. He hadn't said a word since they left the curb. His body was still there, strapped in next to his mother, but his mind hadn't caught up. He was still back at the bench under the weight of that gaze, the barked commands, the heat in his ears when the sirens screamed for him, not for her. He didn't want to cry. He wasn't going to cry. "Say it," Camille finally said, voice like dusk, low and calm, but carrying a storm beneath it. Malik blinked. "Say what?" "What's in your chest right now. Let it out." He hesitated. Then he turned to her, his voice breaking into sharp pieces. "I was reading." His breath shook. "I was just reading, Mom, and they looked at me like I was stealing air." Camille's jaw tightened. She didn't speak. "They made me feel like I didn't belong in my own skin," he whispered. And that broke her. Not her voice, not her body, but something deep in her eyes flared, fury and sorrow, in equal measure. "You do belong," she said. "Every inch of you, everywhere." "Bert, I couldn't breathe," Malik said, his hand now pressed flat over his chest. "It felt like I was shrinking, like if I stayed quiet enough, still enough, they'd let me go." Camille's eyes flicked toward him. "And that's what they want. Shrinking, quiet, gone." Malik didn't answer. Outside the window, Atlanta passed in soft golden hues, the late afternoon sun bleeding into rooftops and casting long, thoughtful shadows across the sidewalks. When they pulled into the driveway, Camille turned off the ignition, but didn't move. She sat there, hands still on the wheel, the engine now quiet, the hum replaced by the sound of cicadas and distant lawnmowers. "We're going to change this," she said. "With everything we've got." Later that evening, in their kitchen, surrounded by granite counters, open cabinets, and the faint smell of lemon cleaner, Malik sat at the table while Camille dialed. Not friends, not family. Reporters, community leaders, city council, the chief of police. Her voice was steady, direct. "I'm not calling as the mayor. I'm calling as a mother. And this city just treated my son like a threat for daring to exist in public. That ends now." "Can you She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Each call was a fuse lit. Each promise of action a match dropped. Malik watched from his seat, arms crossed, chin resting on his fists. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Meetings, statements, headlines. But something had shifted. A storm had formed. And this time, his mother was at the eye of it. The next morning, Camille stood in the press room of City Hall. The podium lights were bright, the room buzzed with journalists. Cameras clicked, screens lit. It was the same podium she'd stood at 100 times before. To celebrate progress, to announce projects, to respond to budget crises. But this time, her voice had a different weight. "I want to speak. Not just as a mayor, but as a mother." The room fell silent. She looked down, then up, into the lens of every camera. "Yesterday, my son, Malik Carter, a 14-year-old student, was approached by officers in a public park. Not for breaking the law, not for acting erratically, but for sitting, reading, existing." "Gasp," murmured. Camille continued. "He was assumed guilty by appearance, labeled suspicious for being still, interrogated without cause, all because one person let fear speak louder than reason." And pause. "I will not let this city become a place where children of color are taught to lower their heads to survive." Malik watched a live stream from her office, sitting on the leather couch beside her assistant, his face unreadable, but his eyes were full. After the press conference, Camille held a private meeting with the police chief and top brass from the department. Malik was invited to attend, at her insistence. He stood in front of them, not as a victim, but as a witness. His words were quiet. I was scared. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I knew they wouldn't see me. They'd only see the story they wanted to believe. The room listened. Silent. And in that silence, Malik did something powerful and didn't cry. He didn't beg. He just told the truth. And it echoed. By that weekend, Camille had drafted a new policy directive. Mandatory anti-bias and community empathy training for every officer in the department, effective immediately. Public parks were now being reviewed for security protocols. With a special task force formed to study racially motivated civilian calls, Joanne Whitmore was invited, not forced, to the first session. She came. Her delivery, hair pulled back in a tight bun, again, but something in her eyes had shifted. She didn't speak much, just listened, as others shared what it meant to walk through the world unseen, or worse, constantly seen as a threat. Malik saw her again at the end of the week. Same park, same bench. She approached, slow, caught. I came to say something, she said. He stood up, calm, taller than she remembered, clear-eyed. I'm listening, he said. Joanne swallowed. I was wrong, she said. I thought I was being careful, but I was being careless. I'm sorry. Malik nodded once. It hurt, he said. You don't get to walk that back with just words. I know. I hope you mean it. And they stood in silence. Two people, two truths. Then Joanne did something simple. So she, on the bench, beside him, but near enough to learn. And for the first time, Malik didn't feel watched. He felt seen. 3 days after the press conference, the city began to move differently. Not all at once, not with parades or proclamations, but in small, deliberate steps, like boots pressing down on soft soil, leaving new footprints. Mayor Simone Carter stood at the heart of it, clipboard in hand, walking the corridors of the Atlanta Police Academy as if she were inspecting battle lines. Around her, training officers stood at attention, recruits seated in rows, eyes uncertain but attentive. This wasn't a photo op. It wasn't for press. It was for accountability. We're not here to play defense, she said, her voice echoing across the echoey walls. We're here to dismantle the reflexes that cost my son his peace and nearly his safety. The recruits shifted in their chairs. One raised a tentative hand. Oui, ma'am, what exactly are we being trained for? Kabyle stared at him. Not harsh, but direct. To see, she said. To see what bias looks like when it wears your badge, and to make sure you never let it speak louder than your oath. Outside the glass-paneled hallway, Malik waited. He wore a simple sweatshirt and jeans, his backpack slung low on one shoulder. He watched silently as the doors swung open and officers filed into the training room. He wasn't part of the curriculum, but he was the reason for it. Sergeant Leo Daniels emerged, nodding as he passed. You coming in? He asked Malik gently. Malik hesitated. Will they listen? Daniels offered a thin smile. Some won't. Most will. But they'll never forget. Malik nodded and stepped inside. The presentation began with a quiet video, no dramatic music, no voiceover. Just photos. Kids sitting on park benches. Teenagers walking home with headphones. Fathers holding their children near street corners. Each photo slowly faded into a police report headline. Suspicious activity, possible loitering, unconfirmed threat. Then came Malik's image. Still, soft lit, sitting on a bench, book opened in his lap. The room went still. Malik stepped to the front. "I'm not here to make anyone feel guilty," he began. "But I need you to understand what it feels like when the world watches you through fear and calls it protection." He paused, then added, "When you approached me with your hands near your holster, I wasn't thinking about laws. I was thinking about whether I'd make it home." An officer in the front row lowered his eyes. Malik's voice held steady. "You carry power. Every word, every look, every silence. It weighs something. Don't use it to crush people like me." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was real. Later that afternoon, Camille walked the halls of City Hall, flanked by her staff and a photographer, capturing a series of new initiatives. But halfway to her office, she paused. At the far end of the corridor stood Joanne Whitmore. No press, no escort. Just her. She looked different. Hair untied, face bare, eyes less rigid. "I wasn't invited," Joanne said quietly, "but I wanted to come anyway." Camille tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Joanne stepped forward. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of reflection. "Because I'm ashamed. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking to be useful." Camille regarded her for a long moment. Finally, she pointed to the conference room down the hall. "This workshop starting in 10. Go in. Sit in the back. Listen." Joanne nodded. "Thank you." Camille turned away, but then paused. "When this is over," she said, without looking back, "you and I are going to speak. Not as enemies, but as women who saw something broken." "I'm ready," Joanne said. The door clicked shut behind her. Meanwhile, Malik returned to the park. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. He walked slowly past the bench where everything happened, past the fountain, past the oak trees that had watched it all in silence. He stopped near the playground, watching kids run and chase each other beneath a gold-streaked sky. Then he saw a boy, maybe 9 or 10, sitting alone, looking anxious, clutching a backpack. Malik walked over. "Hey," he said gently. "You okay?" The boy looked up, startled. "I'm just waiting for my mom. She's late." Malik smiled. "I've been there," he said, sitting down beside him. He sat in silence for a moment. Then the boy asked, "Are you that kid from the news?" Malik chuckled. "Yeah, I guess I am." "What happened?" the boy whispered. Malik thought for a second. "'Cause I was mistaken for a threat, but I reminded them I'm more than that." The boy nodded. "I'm glad you did." The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the playground. Eventually, a car pulled up. The boy stood. "That's her," he said. "Thanks for sitting with me." "No problem." Before he ran off, he turned and said, "You made this park feel safer." Malik watched him go. And for the first time since everything began, the bench didn't feel like a scar. It felt like a marker of where something ended, and where something braver began. The park had begun to quiet, but silence didn't mean safety. Silence, in this moment, was pressure. Tense, sharp, waiting to snap. Cameron's arms were still raised. His mother, Mayor Elise Monroe, stood beside him with her hand protectively on his back. Sergeant Dalton had led them slightly away from the gathering crowd, attempting to defuse the situation before it fully ignited. Officer Jennings remained nearby, visibly uncertain, while Margaret Fulton lingered at a distance, clutching her phone as if it could somehow undo what had just happened. Then it happened. Cameron flinched. A rustle from the crowd. A voice, uncertain, alarmed, called out, "He's got something!" Heads turned. Margaret's eyes widened. It wasn't Cameron. It was a man, unknown, unaccounted for, stepping forward near the park's edge, hoodie half-zipped, eyes wide and darting. From his waistband he pulled a small folding knife, the blade glinting under the late afternoon sun. He shouted something incoherent, stepping toward Elise and her son. Dalton reacted instantly. "Get back," he shouted, drawing his weapon and stepping in front of the mayor. Jennings moved with him, creating a barrier between the man and the boy. Elise didn't flinch. She stood still, her hand still on Cameron's back, her eyes locked on the attacker. Not with fear, but with resolve. Cameron's pulse roared in his ears. He couldn't breathe. All he could see was the blade and the flash of it catching light. The man was close now. 10 feet, 8. "Drop it," Dalton barked, stepping forward with military precision. "I said back off," the man screamed, his voice cracking. He wasn't steady. His stance wavered, his hand shook. A child behind the fountain screamed. In that second, Elise Monroe did something no one expected. She stepped forward. One step, only one, enough to bring the man's gaze directly to her. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice calm but cutting like steel. "You're scared, I see that, but you need to put the knife down, right now." Her words struck a nerve. He blinked. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. And that was enough. Dalton lunged. His shoulder drove forward with explosive force, slamming into the man's side. The blade hit the ground, clattering across the pavement. Jennings was there in a breath. Knee to spine, cuffs on wrists. Silence again. Silent. This time, not from tension, but from stunned relief. Cameron stood frozen, his chest heaving. Elise turned to him and touched his cheek gently. "You're okay," she whispered. He nodded, though he didn't fully believe it yet. Dalton approached. "Are either of you hurt?" "No," Elise answered for them both, "but he needs a moment." They led Cameron to a nearby bench. Jennings secured the attacker and called for backup. Margaret remained rooted in place, her eyes round, her face pale. She had witnessed more than she intended, more than she was prepared for. Then she approached slowly. Her voice cracked. "Mayor Monroe, I'm so sorry." Elise didn't turn to her. She kept her eyes on her son. "You need to say that to him," she said softly. Margaret turned to Cameron, who still sat on the bench, his shoulders hunched. "I didn't mean for any of this," she began. Cameron looked up. His eyes filled not with anger, but with something deeper. Weariness. Hurt. "But you started it," he said, voice low. "You didn't need a knife to scare me. You had your phone." Margaret couldn't answer. She just stood there, words caught in her throat. It wasn't a toy. Elise finally looked at her. "You need to ask yourself," she said, "how it got to this point. Because for us, this isn't new. It's just another Tuesday." She stood, helping her son up. Officers began cordoning off the scene again. The suspect was loaded into the cruiser. As Elise and Cameron prepared to leave, Sergeant Dalton spoke one last time. "We'll need full statements," he said, respectful but firm. "You'll have them," Elise replied. "And I expect this incident, including the actions of your officers, to be reviewed fully." Dalton nodded. "Yes, ma'am." They walked back to Elise's car. Before stepping in, Cameron looked back at the bench. The book he had been reading earlier was still lying there. pages fluttering slightly in the wind. He walked back and picked it up. "I just wanted to read," he said softly. Elise put her hand on his shoulder. "And you will. And you'll walk into every park, every school, every street like you belong. Because you do." They're in and drove away. But in the rear-view mirror, Cameron could still see Margaret, standing alone now, watching the car disappear. The ride home was quiet, but not empty. Elise Monroe kept both hands steady on the wheel, but her knuckles were white, gripping tighter than usual. The soft hum of the city's traffic floated through the windows, mingling with the memory of shouted commands and a blade catching sunlight. Beside her, Cameron sat in silence. His hands were clasped in his lap, fingers intertwined so tightly they were pale at the knuckles. His backpack lay forgotten at his feet. The book he'd been reading earlier was clenched beneath his arm, bent at the spine now, as if the pages themselves had absorbed the weight of what had happened. Halfway through the ride, Elise reached out and turned off the radio. The silence became deeper, more intimate. "You okay?" she asked finally, eyes still on the road. Cameron didn't answer right away. He stared out the window at a row of shops blurred by speed. Then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, he said, "Why does it keep happening, Mom? Even when I do nothing, it still finds me." Elise swallowed hard. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. "Because the world isn't always ready to see you for who you are. Sometimes it only sees what it fears." He nodded slightly. "But I wasn't afraid, not really. Not until he pulled the knife. Before that it was just like I wasn't supposed to exist there." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't blink. "You belong there, Cameron. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. That park, that bench, that sun. You have a right to all of it." The words hung in the space between them. They reached home in silence, pulling into the driveway just as dusk began to creep across the sky. Elise turned off the engine but made no move to get out. "Come inside," she said gently. The camera stayed in the car for a few moments longer. When he finally followed her in, his first steps across the tile floor felt heavier than usual, as though the day had added weight to his every movement. That night, Elise sat at her desk in the study, reading reports from City Hall. But her mind kept drifting. Back to the bench, to the flash of a blade, to Margaret's cracked apology. Cameron appeared at the doorway. "Can I show you something?" "He does." She looked up and nodded. He held out a folded sheet of paper, creased from where he'd been gripping it in his palm. She unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing. Rough pencil strokes, but clear. A park bench. A boy reading. And behind him, eyes. Watching. Accusing. But in the top corner of the page, he'd drawn a second figure. A woman. One arm. Around the boy. The other stretched wide, like a shield. "That's you," he said. Elise couldn't speak. She nodded, lips pressed together. Cameron sat down next to her. "I want to talk to someone," he said. "A counselor. Or someone who gets this." Elise placed a hand over his. "We'll find the right one." The next morning, Elise arrived at City Hall earlier than usual. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she strode down the corridor toward the mayor's office. She didn't sit behind her desk. Instead, she called an emergency meeting with the police commissioner, community leaders, and legal advisors. Within hours, a new directive was drafted. A citywide initiative on racial bias and youth safety. Anti-bias training would become mandatory not just for officers, but for all public servants. She gave it a name, Project Vigil. Later that week, in a crowded press conference, Elise stood behind the podium with a photograph of her son. Not the smiling school portrait, but a candid shot of him sitting on that very bench, taken by a bystander before things escalated. "This is my son," she said, her voice steady. "He is kind, thoughtful, brilliant. And last week he was treated like a threat for doing nothing more than sitting and waiting." Flashbulbs popped. Reporters scribbled. "I am proud to be his mother, but I should not have to be the mayor to ensure his safety. Every child, every person, deserves the right to exist without fear." From the back of the room, Cameron watched. He stood taller than he had a week ago, not because the fear had vanished, but because he now understood that being seen came with responsibility. 2 days later, Margaret appeared at the first Project Visual community circle. She sat in the back, at first rigid, silent, but when it came time to speak, she raised her hand. "I'm here because I need to be," she said, voice cracking. "What I did, I can't undo, but I can learn, and I can listen." There was a long pause. Then one of the youth facilitators nodded. "Yeah, well, that's a start." Back home, Elise walked past Cameron's room one evening and saw the light still on. She knocked lightly. "Still awake? Wouldn't mind if I come in?" He shrugged. "Sure." She sat at the edge of his bed. The drawing was now pinned to his wall. Below it, a new one was taped. This time, the same bench, but empty. Peaceful, as it should have been. "I like this one," she said. "Me too," he replied. "It's what I want to remember." Lise leaned in and kissed his forehead. "You're not just strong, Cam," she whispered. "You're becoming wise." He smiled. "Like you?" She laughed softly. "Not even close, but I'm getting there." And outside, the city pulsed with the quiet beat of change. Not loud, not complete, but real. A reckoning had begun. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at Riverside Park, but its echoes still lingered like footsteps in a long hallway, faint but always approaching. Inside City Hall, the walls seemed to breathe with urgency. Elise Monroe moved through them like a current, sharp, deliberate. Her heels tapped out a rhythm of momentum as she entered the Community Oversight Board's meeting room, now repurposed for something far greater than bureaucracy. The table was no longer a place of paper shuffling and procedural delay. It was now a war room. Pinned across the whiteboard behind Elise were dozens of color-coded notes, timelines of citywide bias incidents, reports from school districts, summaries of officer conduct. At the center, outlined in bold red marker, were 3 words. Across the room, Cameron stood near the window, holding a stack of printed flyers. He didn't say much, but his eyes were alert, taking in every word his mother spoke to the assembly of police supervisors, school administrators, and youth advocates. Elise turned to the group. Bias doesn't end when the moment passes. It settles. It spreads until someone calls it out. What happened in that park isn't isolated. It's systemic. And we're going after the system. Silence followed. Then Captain Hughes, a grizzled officer in his late 50s, finally spoke up. "It's ambitious, Mayor. You're talking citywide recalibration, retraining everyone, from janitors to judges." Elise nodded. "Exactly. Change isn't passive. It requires confrontation." Cameron, still holding the flyers, walked over and placed them on the table. The top one read, "See us, know us, stand with us." Beneath was a photo of him. On that bench, book in hand. There was a murmur around the room. "Where did you get that photo?" Hughes asked. "A bystander," Elise answered. "Before the chaos began, before he became a suspicious person. When he was just a boy. Her voice didn't rise, but the air around her thickened. From the side of the room, a younger officer, Lieutenant Martinez, leaned forward. "I showed this to my daughter. She's 12. She said, 'He looks like he's just waiting for someone.' That stuck with me." Elise allowed the silence to settle again. Then she said, "That's how this begins, with one moment seen clearly, instead of clouded by fear." She tapped the table. "Next week, we launch listening forums, one in every district, open to all, especially those who've been silent too long." Cameron looked up at his mother. For the first time, he saw not just a leader, but a builder. Not just a fighter, but a nurturer of new ground. That weekend, under gray spring skies, the first listening forum took place in the Eastwood Community Center, a square brick building with mismatched folding chairs and the smell of old wood and coffee. Cameron sat near the back, between two other teens. One wore headphones, the other doodled on his jeans with a pen. But both listened. At the front, Elise introduced Margaret Lewis. The room quieted. Margaret took a slow breath before speaking. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a plain gray sweater and the weight of a mistake. "I'm not here to be forgiven," she said, voice trembling. "I'm here because I want to be useful. I made a choice that day, based on fear, not fact, and I could have destroyed a boy's life. That's what bias does. It blinds you, and sometimes it weaponizes you." Her hands shook slightly, but she didn't stop. "I'm not asking you to trust me today. I'm asking you to let me help tear down the wall I once stood behind." Long silence followed. Then a hand went up in the third row. A young man, no older than Cameron, stood and said, "What made you change?" Margaret looked toward Cameron, hearing someone else's truth and realizing how much I never knew about my own. There was no applause. Just silence. Thick. Full. Later that night, as the rain began to drizzle over the city, Cameron and Elise returned home. The streetlights glowed against the wet asphalt. Inside, the house was quiet, but in that quiet, something new stirred. Momentum. Cameron walked into the living room, pulled down the old corkboard they'd once used for school projects, and began pinning things to it. Quotes from the forums, new flyers, and in the center, his own words. "I am not your fear. I am my future." Elise watched him, arms folded. "You're building something," she said. Cameron didn't look up. "So are you." Then he turned, holding up a new flyer design. "Mom, can we print these for the next forum?" He smiled. "We'll print 1,000. The ripple had begun. But this time, it wasn't fear that spread. It was resolve. A week after the first community forum, the city was already shifting, quietly but undeniably. At Eastbridge High, the anti-bias curriculum Elise Monroe had fought to implement was entering its third day. Teachers, once hesitant, now led discussions with open faces and steady voices. Students, some skeptical, others curious, filled classrooms with their lived experiences, questions, and uneasy truths. In room 204, Cameron sat near the front. His palms were slightly damp against the desk as he waited for his turn to speak. The teacher, Mr. Holcomb, had asked each student to share a moment when they had either witnessed or experienced bias, and how they reacted. Those spoke quickly, eyes downcast, a few deflected with humor. Then it was Cameron's turn. He stood. His voice didn't shake. "I was sitting on a bench in the park, waiting for my mom," he began. "Reading, just reading. And someone saw me as a threat." The room stilled. I didn't yell. I didn't run. I just stayed. Even when the cops came. Even when they questioned me. Even when they reached for their belts. We paused. My mom showed up. Before they go further, she's the mayor, but if she hadn't, I don't know where I'd be right now. But silence. A long one. Then a girl named Brielle raised her hand. I saw that video online, she said softly. I didn't know it was you. Cameron nodded. It was. Mr. Holcomb stepped forward. Thank you, Cameron. That took courage. Later, in the hallway, 2 students approached him, boys from the football team, not ones he spoke to often. Hey, one said, that was heavy. The other added, you got guts, man. Just wanted to say respect. Cameron gave a small nod. Thanks. It wasn't about fame or recognition, but for the first time, he felt like his story had done more than echo. It had landed. Across town, Elise stood in the city council chambers, watching a new kind of fire spread. This wasn't protest. It was participation. Residents packed the room. Young, old, black, white, Latino, Asian. Unified not in rage, but in resolve. One by one, they shared stories. About parks, about bus stops, about schools, about offices. Moments where silence had protected injustice. Moments where assumptions. Elise didn't interrupt. She listened, took notes, and when her turn came to speak, she didn't speak from a podium. She stepped down into the aisle and stood among them. I've learned, she said, that policy without proximity is empty. If I don't feel your stories, I can't write laws that honor them. I'm here not just as a leader, but as someone still learning. Her words were met with nods and quiet claps. And then, an older man in the back stood, tall, weathered, with a cane that clicked against the tiled floor. Ma'am, he said, my name's Walter Griggs. I've lived here 60 years, and I've never seen this city try to listen this hard. A hush fell again. Walter continued, we've had a lot of fire, a lot of pain, but today feels different. That night, Elise returned home to find Cameron on the back porch, sketching on a large notepad. He was drawing a mural, one he planned to propose for the city youth center. In it, a figure sat on a bench, holding a book, but around him colors burst outward, gold, crimson, cobalt. Each line was movement. Each brushstroke was freedom. Elise stepped behind him. Is that you? She asked gently. He nodded. Yeah, but it's not just about me. It's about what I want others to see. That we're more than how they frame us. She touched his shoulder. They will, baby. They will. Days later, the mural committee met. Cameron presented his concept. He didn't just talk about art. He talked about truth, about how public spaces needed to reflect everyone, about how stories deserved to be seen. They approved it unanimously. And when it went up, 12 feet wide, lit by solar fixtures at night, it didn't just change the wall, it changed the block. Children stopped to stare. Teens took photos. Adults whispered things like, "That's from the park, isn't it?" Yes. But it was more than that. It was from the heart of a movement that didn't shout, but refused to stay quiet. Back at the mayor's office, Elise received an envelope. Inside was a letter from the Department of Justice, a grant large enough to expand the anti-bias initiative state. She leaned back in her chair, eyes wide, then whispered, "It's working." Across the city, change continued. Margaret Lewis, now a regular at the youth center, led a workshop titled When Assumptions Lie. She didn't pretend to be perfect, but she showed up, she owned her mistake, and she helped others see before they judged. One afternoon, while handing out paint supplies for a community project, she looked up and saw Cameron watching from the doorway. Their eyes met. She smiled. He nodded. Then he stepped forward to paint. In the marble-walled courtroom of Fulton County, the echo of history hung heavier than the judge's gavel. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, carving golden streaks across the pews, where spectators waited in tense silence. The flags behind the bench stood tall. One for justice, the other for a nation still learning what that truly means. At the center of it all sat Margaret Lewis, not in chains, not in disgrace, but present. Beside her, on the wooden bench, was a folded paper. A statement she had written and rewritten for weeks. One that wasn't about excuses, but reckoning. Across the aisle, Elise Monroe sat tall in a navy blue blazer, hands folded, eyes unwavering. Cameron sat beside her, wearing a simple charcoal shirt and a quiet kind of strength. He didn't fidget. He didn't look away. He'd already done the hard part now. He was here to witness the rest. Judge Alvarez entered, black robes sweeping across the polished floor, like shadows catching up with the past. The clerk read the docket. Charges: filing a false police report, public endangerment, racial profiling in a protected civil zone. Margaret stood when asked. Her voice, when it came, was thin, but not weak. "Your Honor," she began, "I've spent my entire life thinking I was a good person. I followed rules, paid taxes, smiled at my neighbors, but I didn't see how dangerous my fear had become." It's just swallowed. "I didn't just call the police that day. I called them with a narrative, one I created in my own head. A young boy on a bench became a threat. Because I couldn't separate my bias from reality, and that could have ended in tragedy." And her voice broke, but she didn't cry. I'm not asking for forgiveness. That's not mine to demand. But I do ask for responsibility, and I accept whatever this court decides." The courtroom was still. Even the lights seemed to hum quieter. Then the judge leaned forward, fingers interlaced. "Miss Lewis," he said slowly, "this court doesn't exist only to punish. It exists to correct, and the measure of justice is not only in what you suffer, but in what you rebuild." He paused, eyes scanning the rows. Community service. Full cooperation with the anti-bias education program, and mandatory monthly forums where you will speak not as a victim, but as a mirror. Margaret bowed her head. "Yes, Your Honor." Outside, under the wide Georgia sky, the press swarmed. But Elise didn't stop for microphones. Neither did Cameron. They walked quietly to the car, the courthouse's white columns rising behind them like solemn promises. In the back seat, Cameron finally spoke. "He didn't run from it," he said. "No," Elise replied. "And that matters." That evening, in a more private place, a different reckoning took place. At the city council chambers, Elise addressed a closed session of civic leaders. Her speech was not polished. It didn't need to be. Today wasn't about vengeance, she said. It was about a city that chooses to confront itself. She held up a printed screenshot from a news article. Cameron on the bench, hands raised. This image went viral. But the real story isn't the panic. It's the healing that followed, the changes we forced. the conversations we sparked. She let the silence settle before adding, "And this is only the beginning." Applause was quiet, some just nodded, but there was resolve in the room. Meanwhile, in the heart of Riverside Park, something extraordinary was happening. Children gathered around a paint-splattered ladder. Murals now lined the path that once bore shadows of injustice. On the bench, yes, that bench, sat Cameron, now with a sketchbook in hand, not fear. Kids laughed nearby. A teenage girl asked if he could draw her. Margaret stood off to the side, holding a bag of chalk for the community art day. She wasn't center stage. She didn't need to be. Cameron caught her eye once, and for the first time, he offered her something unexpected. And then, not forgiveness, but perhaps recognition. Later that night, Elise and Cameron returned home. On their doorstep sat a small box. No note, no name. Beside the Medal of Valor, Jan said, and claimed it. Camus lifted it, the bronze catching the light like fire. "Who's this for?" he asked. Elise smiled. "Maybe it's not for one person." She stepped inside. But Cameron lingered a moment longer. Then slowly he placed the medal back in the box, closed the lid, and left it on the hallway table, where anyone could see it. Like hidden, not claimed. Dirt. Shed. Like justice. It ended not with headlines, nor with parades, but with Cameron quietly returning to the same bench where it all began. No police lights, no angry voices, just the wind rustling through the trees and the gentle creak of wood as he sat down. Book in hand, peace reclaimed. It was healing without spectacle, dignity without applause, the kind of strength that grows in stillness and lives on long after the noise has faded. But change doesn't sleep, and justice, once shaken awake, cannot go back to bed. Elise continued her push at City Hall. Margaret, once a shadow in Cameron's memory, now stood beside other volunteers, painting murals with children. And the park, it stayed open, safe, watched not with suspicion, but with shared responsibility. The ripples of what happened will never fully disappear. But that's the point. Sometimes, the greatest injustices don't wear uniforms. They sit on park benches. They whisper doubt into otherwise quiet days. And when we're not looking, they slip into our judgments, disguised as concern or safety. But the lesson Cameron and Elise left us isn't about rage. It's about resolve. For those of us who have lived long enough to see cycles repeat, prejudice resurfacing under new names, the question isn't if we're tired, it's whether we're willing to remain awake. Awake to the quiet acts of bravery, awake to the hard conversations, awake to the uncomfortable truths that demand more than memory. They demand movement. Because justice is not a finish line. It's a habit. And when we keep, and we pass on. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, Racist Stories Uncovered, and share this video with someone who still believes in the power of change. When stories like these reach the right hearts, they don't just spark awareness, they ignite accountability. Thank you for listening.